Imagine a place that began as a wilderness of forests, rivers, and Great Lakes, became one of North America's most important fur trading frontiers, transformed into a lumber powerhouse, and eventually became the place where the modern automobile industry changed the world. That place is Michigan. But Michigan's story is far more complicated than cars, factories, and Detroit. Long before assembly lines dominated the landscape, indigenous peoples had already built cultures and communities across this region for thousands of years. Then came French explorers, British forces, American settlers, industrial giants, massive waves of migration, economic collapse, and one of the most dramatic urban transformations in American history. So how did Michigan go from a remote frontier to the center of America's Industrial Revolution? The story begins thousands of years ago. Long before European explorers arrived, Paleoindian peoples were already living across what is now Michigan. Over generations, different forest cultures developed around the Great Lakes and the region's extensive network of rivers. The environment itself shaped their way of life. The lakes and rivers provided abundant fish, while the forests supplied game, plants, and other resources. Agriculture gradually became part of life as well, allowing communities to combine farming with hunting, fishing, and seasonal movement. Michigan also possessed something else that would become incredibly valuable: copper. High-purity copper deposits in the region supported an important tradition of copper working long before European colonization. Michigan was also connected to the enormous Hopewell trade network, which linked communities across a huge portion of North America. These connections weren't just about exchanging objects. They allowed ideas, traditions, and knowledge to travel across enormous distances. One of the most remarkable reminders of these early cultures can still be found in Michigan today: ancient rock carvings known as petroglyphs. At one protected site, around 165 glyphs are carved into a rocky outcrop, preserving traditional knowledge and stories passed down through generations. But by the time Europeans began entering the Great Lakes, Michigan was already a region of movement and changing alliances. French explorers were among the first Europeans to push deep into the Great Lakes. One of the most fascinating figures was Étienne Brulé, a French explorer who spent significant time among indigenous communities and learned their languages and customs. His journeys helped expand European knowledge of the Great Lakes and opened the way for an enormous trading network. And soon, one resource would dominate everything: beaver fur. During the 1600s, demand for beaver pelts in Europe turned the Great Lakes into one of the most valuable hunting and trading regions in North America. French traders traveled deeper into the wilderness, while indigenous communities became essential participants in the expanding trade. Trading posts appeared along waterways, then came forts, then settlements. Sault Ste. Marie became one of the earliest major French settlements in the region, followed by Fort Detroit in 1701. But the French presence wasn't primarily about filling Michigan with European settlers. Instead, France was interested in trade, military influence, and missionary activity. The fur trade brought wealth, but it also brought devastating consequences. Firearms, alcohol, and diseases entered indigenous communities, while European competition increasingly changed existing political and economic relationships. Then everything changed again. France and Britain had been competing for control of North America for generations. Their rivalry eventually exploded into the French and Indian War. When France lost in 1763, its position in Michigan effectively collapsed, and Britain took control. But the British quickly discovered that controlling the land was easier than controlling the people living on it. Their policies created resentment among many indigenous nations, contributing to Pontiac's War and later resistance movements. Then came the American Revolution. Michigan wasn't the main battlefield, but its location made it strategically important. Fort Detroit became a British base for operations against American settlements farther south. When the war ended and the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, Michigan was transferred to the newly formed United States. But the United States soon faced another problem. Indigenous nations in the region did not simply accept the new government's claims to their lands. A powerful native confederacy emerged, resisting American expansion. The conflict became known as the Northwest Indian War, and for a time, indigenous forces achieved major victories against the young United States. Eventually, however, American forces defeated the Confederacy at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. That defeat opened the door for a new phase in Michigan's history. American settlement began increasing rapidly. Michigan became a territory in 1805, and as its population grew, pressure mounted for statehood. But even that process wasn't straightforward. Michigan became involved in a bizarre territorial dispute with neighboring Ohio over an area known as the Toledo Strip. The disagreement became so serious that both sides mobilized forces, creating what became known as the Toledo War. Michigan eventually surrendered its claim to the disputed strip in exchange for gaining the Upper Peninsula, and on January 26, 1837, Michigan became the 26th state of the United States. The new state immediately began thinking big. Michigan invested heavily in roads and railways, hoping infrastructure would connect its communities and accelerate economic growth. But there was a problem. The state borrowed heavily to finance its ambitions, and the financial crisis of 1837 nearly pushed Michigan toward bankruptcy. Still, the investment revealed something important about Michigan. The state wasn't content to remain a remote frontier. It wanted to become an economic power. Education was another priority. The University of Michigan, established in 1817, became part of a growing educational tradition. Michigan also adopted unusually progressive reforms for the era. The state moved away from harsh forms of punishment and toward rehabilitation, while capital punishment was abolished in 1846. At the same time, Michigan developed a strong anti-slavery movement and became an important route on the Underground Railroad, helping enslaved African Americans escape toward freedom and Canada. But Michigan's biggest transformation was about to begin. Under the forests and around the Great Lakes were enormous natural resources. Iron and copper mining expanded rapidly. Agriculture grew in southern Michigan, and the state became an important producer of wheat and other crops. Railroads and canals made it easier to move those resources. And then there was timber. Michigan's vast forests became one of the foundations of its 19th century economy. At its peak, the state supplied roughly a quarter of the nation's timber. The money generated by logging helped build infrastructure, businesses, towns, and fortunes. But the timber boom was also creating the foundation for something even bigger: the automobile. Before cars dominated Michigan, the state already had a strong carriage and wagon manufacturing industry. That meant Michigan possessed skilled workers, factories, transportation networks, and industrial experience that could be adapted to the new technology. Then came men like Ransom Olds and Henry Ford. Olds helped pioneer mass automobile production, while Ford would take the idea to an entirely different level. In 1908, Ford introduced the Model T. The car itself was revolutionary, but the real game changer was how Ford produced it. Mass production dramatically lowered manufacturing costs, making automobiles accessible to millions of ordinary Americans. Michigan suddenly wasn't simply producing cars. It was helping reshape American life. Factories multiplied. Workers arrived from across the country. Detroit exploded in size. Between 1910 and 1930, Detroit's population increased by more than 5 times. And by 1940, Michigan had become the center of global automobile manufacturing. But success can create its own vulnerability. When the Great Depression struck, Michigan's dependence on industrial manufacturing became a weakness. Automobile production collapsed, factories closed, and unemployment soared. Then, World War II changed everything. Michigan's factories were transformed from producing civilian automobiles to producing military equipment. The state became known as the Arsenal of Democracy. Thousands of tanks, aircraft, and other weapons poured out of Michigan's industrial facilities. The war revived the state's economy and demonstrated the enormous manufacturing power it had built. After the war, Michigan entered another period of transformation. African Americans migrated north in large numbers, searching for industrial jobs and better economic opportunities. Detroit became one of the major destinations of the Great Migration. But rapid population growth also created social tensions. By the 1960s, racial inequality, housing segregation, and economic divisions had become major problems. In 1967, Detroit experienced one of the most destructive urban uprisings in American history. At the same time, the automobile industry that had created Michigan's prosperity was beginning to change. From the 1970s onward, factories closed, manufacturing jobs disappeared, and entire neighborhoods suffered. Places that had once been filled with workers and thriving businesses increasingly faced abandoned buildings, unemployment, and crime. The city that had once symbolized America's industrial future was now being forced to confront its industrial decline. Detroit eventually filed for bankruptcy in 2013, becoming a powerful symbol of the challenges facing America's older industrial cities. But Michigan's story didn't end there. Tourism, technology, education, healthcare, advanced manufacturing, and new investment began creating new opportunities. Former industrial districts started being redeveloped. Detroit began attracting entrepreneurs, investors, residents, and visitors once again. And that may be the most fascinating part of Michigan's history. The state has repeatedly reinvented itself. It began with indigenous communities adapting to the Great Lakes environment. Then came the fur trade, then agriculture, then mining and timber, then automobiles, then wartime manufacturing. And now, another transformation is underway. Michigan's history is essentially a story of reinvention. A place once viewed as a distant frontier became America's lumber capital. That lumber wealth helped create the industrial foundations that eventually made Michigan the heart of the automobile age. And for a state that has already transformed itself so many times, the biggest question may not be what Michigan was. It's what Michigan becomes next. If you enjoyed this journey through Michigan's incredible history, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We explore the hidden stories, dramatic transformations, and fascinating histories behind places you thought you already knew. And if you want to discover how other American states went from forgotten frontiers to economic powerhouses, make sure you stay with us, because the next story might be even more surprising. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.